All right, so lesson 1-5 is about rounding decimals. And you guys already worked on rounding whole numbers last year in fourth grade. It was 4 and below. Drop to the flow. I didn't make this up. And we're going to put a little apostrophe there. Flow really means floor, but that doesn't rhyme with below, so we're going to call it flow. 5 and above, or 5 and up. Jump up. There's a lot of little phrases like this that you can use, but we're going to go with these because that's what came to mind. So let's practice with a whole number real quick. So let's say we have 234, and then our other number is going to be 456. And we want to round both of these to the nearest hundreds place. So let's say they said round this to the nearest hundreds. That means we're going to go ahead and underline our hundreds place. We know that these are whole numbers. So the one all the way to the right is going to be ones, tens, hundreds. So we can go ahead and underline the hundreds. It's going to go ones, tens, hundreds. And then when you're rounding to the nearest hundreds, you're actually going to look at the neighbor to the right, and we're going to follow that rule. So the neighbor is either going to be 4 and below or 5 and up. So this is going to be 4 and below because 3 is less than 4. So that means we're going to drop to the flow. That becomes a 0. That becomes a 0. And the 2 won't change. It'll stay the same. The opposite's going to happen here because we notice that this 5, the neighbor for the 4, is 5 and up. So we're going to jump up. So the 4 is actually going to become a 5. And this 5 is going to become a 0 and a 0. So we know with 234, our closest hundreds is the 200s. And then with 456, our closest hundreds is 500. Let's go ahead and look at what this looks like on a number line to clear up what we mean by rounding. If we had a number line and it's at 200 to 300, because we want to look at the closest 100. So that'll be either 200 or 300. Now, we have to think to ourselves, where does 234 fall on the number line? Well, I know that 250 is in the middle. So that means 234 falls anywhere in this range. So 234 is somewhere in there. And we can say it's maybe like right here, kind of close there. And the closest hundreds to that is going to be 200 because it'll only take a little bit more to get to the 200 than it will to get to the 300. So the closest hundreds here, when we round 234 to the closest hundreds, is 200. Now something similar happens for 456. It's either going to be closest to 400 or it's going to be the closest to 500. And I know that 450 falls right there. 456 is bigger than 450. 456 is bigger than 450, so we know it kind of falls like right there. So we can safely say that it's a shorter walk to 500 than it is the walk back to 400. Because we know also that it'll take us 44 steps to get to the 500 and it'll take us 56 to get back down to 400. So the closest hundreds for 456 is 500. That's why we round 456 to 500. And that's why for 234 we round it to 200. Now, to take all the thinking out of rounding, there's another way we can look at this question. We're going to follow very similar rules, but we're going to say 4 and below, we're going to call it 4 minus, equals no change. And then 5 and up, we're going to call plus 1. If you follow this rule, this next series of steps, this will come out pretty easily for you. Let's say we have the number 234, and we want to round this again to the nearest hundreds. You're still going to look at the neighbor, and you're going to determine which rule are we going to follow. Actually, let me make an adjustment real quick. We're not going to call it no change. We're actually just going to write plus 0, just so it's consistent. We're still going to look at the neighbor and determine, is this 4 and below, or is it 5 and up? This is 4 and below, so what we're going to do is the plus 0 rule. I'm going to go ahead and put plus 0 right below that, and I'm going to draw this into a column. 2 plus 0 is 2. everything outside of the column becomes a 0 on the right. And that's it. This is our number, 200. And we can try that again with 456. If we look at the hundreds, we have to look at the neighbor. Determine which rule it is. Is it plus 0 or the plus 1? Well, is it 4 and below? 5 is not 4 and below. So we're actually going to do the plus 1 rule. We're going to put plus 1 right here, and we're going to draw our columns in. 4 plus 1 is 5. Everything to the right of the column becomes a 0. So the 5 becomes a 0, the 6 becomes a 0. There's nothing to the left to write down. We can repeat this with bigger numbers. So let's go 23,458. Let's go ahead and use, let's say we round to the nearest thousands. So we're going to go ahead and write our rule one more time. 4 and below is plus 0. 5 and above is plus 1. Think to yourselves now, we want to round to the nearest thousands, so we're going to underline the thousands place. And then we're going to look at its neighbor to the right. Is the neighbor 4 and below, or is it 5 and above? If you're thinking 4 and below, we know that we have to do plus 0 here. Draw your column in for that one. 3 plus 0 is 3. Everything to the right turns to a 0. Everything to the left stays the same if you didn't change it. So 23,458 to the nearest thousands is just going to be 23,000. Now, sometimes you reach a case where this gets a little bit trickier, and we'll have let me write the rule again. Let's say you're working with a number that's like 9,999, and we want to round this to the nearest tens. Look at the neighbor, and then determine now, is this 4 and below, or is it 5 and above? This is 5 and above, so we know we have to do a plus 1 rule here. 9 plus 1 is 10, but we can't have 2 digits in a 1-digit spot. So you're going to add like normal. 9 plus 1 is 10. 9 plus 1, 10. Regroup the 1. 9 plus 1, 10. So everything on the right we can't copy down because we had to change all of that. Everything to the left we changed because we did a plus 1 at each of those 9s. Now everything to the right still turns to a 0. So when you round 9,999 to the nearest tens, the answer is actually going to be 10,000. The next part of our lesson has to deal with rounding decimals. It's going to follow the exact same rules. You just have to really make sure that you know where your decimal place values are. So as a quick review, just remember, to the right of the decimal, we have our tenths place. To the right of that, we have our hundredths place. And to the right of that, we have our thousandths place. These are our place values for decimals. So let's go ahead and write out our decimal number. We're going to have 23 and 456 thousandths. Let's say I want to round this to the nearest tenths, hundredths, and ones. And let's go ahead and throw in tens as well. So let's start with tenths. What is this going to look like if I try to round it to the nearest tenth? Well, I'm going to go ahead and say, here's our tenths place. I know because I can look at my chart up here. And I can say, look at the neighbor. Is this neighbor 4 and below or 5 and above? It is 5 and above. So we're going to add 1. 4 plus 1 is 5. Everything to the right becomes a 0. Everything to the left, since we didn't change anything, stays the same. Bring your decimal down. 3, 2. So 23 and 456 thousandths to the nearest tenth is 23 and 5 tenths. So if we round this, we're going to change it to 23 and 5 tenths. Now let's say we're rounding to the nearest hundredths. I'm going to write it out again, 23 and 456 thousandths. If I'm rounding to the nearest hundredths this time, I have to underline the hundredths place. I'm still going to look at the neighbor, and I notice that this 6 is 5 and above. So I can do my +1 rule. 5 plus 1 is 6. 6 becomes a 0 because it's on the right of the column. Everything to the left, since we didn't change anything, is going to stay exactly the same, and we just bring them down. So when we round 23 and 456 thousandths to the nearest hundredths, the nearest hundredths is 23 and 46 hundredths. We don't need that 0 at the end anymore. Now let's say we want to round that number again to a different place. We have 23 and 456 thousandths, and we want to round it to the nearest ones place. So I'm going to underline my ones place because I know directly to the left we have the ones, and then the tens, and then the hundreds. So we're underlining our ones place. We're looking at the neighbor. Is this 4 and below, or 5 and above? It's 4 and below, so we follow the +0 rule. 3 plus 0 is 3. Everything to the right became a 0. Your decimal has to stay in the same place, so we're going to leave our decimal there. Bring down your 2. So 23 and 456 thousandths to the nearest ones. They also call this the whole sometimes, the nearest whole. So 23 and 456 thousandths to the nearest whole is just 23. And finally, let's say we want to round this to the nearest tens place. So 23 and 456 thousandths to the nearest tens. We're going to underline our tens place, which is this 2, and we're going to look at the neighbor. The neighbor is 4 and below, so we follow the +0 rule. 2 plus 0 is 2. Everything to the right becomes a 0, but you still bring your decimal down to the exact same spot where we left it. So 23 and 456 thousandths to the nearest tens is 20.